I did not come here to defend borders drawn by strangers with ink on foreign maps. I came here to speak of a truth older than empires. Africa belongs to Africans, and no line can divide the blood of one family.
Tonight, in cities once separated by colonial fences, Windhoek Lusaka and Gaborone leaders stood as brothers and sisters, signing what history will remember as a rupture. For the first time in generations, mothers crossed bridges to embrace children without holding passports. Truck drivers rolled forward with copper and grain, not with bribes in their pockets, but with pride in their hearts. Students waved flags, chanting about a future where opportunity travels faster than checkpoints. This is not simply about three nations. It is about the dignity of millions who have waited too long to walk free on their own land. It is about rediscovering that sovereignty is not the power to guard a line, but the courage to remove it. If you still believe justice is more than a word, if you still believe freedom is not a gift, but a birthright, stay with me. Because what you are about to hear will never appear on the evening news. To understand why this moment feels like an earthquake, we must first remember where the fault line began. In 1884, in a conference room in Berlin, men who had never walked the savannas of Africa picked up their pens and carved the continent into pieces. They drew borders not to reflect people, but to serve power. Rivers became barriers. Villages were cut in half. Families were told they were now foreigners on the other side of their own land. Those borders outlived the empires that created them. Long after colonial flags were lowered, the lines remained, splitting economies, suffocating trade, and turning neighbors into strangers. A farmer in Namibia could see the market for his crops just a mile away in Zambia, yet spend days at checkpoints. A student in Botswana could dream of studying in Lusaka, only to face endless paperwork and fees. For decades, the promise of independence was slowed by chains that were invisible yet heavy. It is here, against this backdrop, that the decision of Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana takes its full meaning. Their leaders stood not only as heads of state, but as heirs of a wounded history. When they signed the Declaration of Free Movement, it was more than a policy. It was a rebuke to the ghosts of Berlin, a way of saying, we decide our future, not the past. The reaction was instant. Families crossed with nothing more than an ID card. Traders spoke of saving days, even weeks on their routes. Social media lit up with images of children waving flags, as though they were waving goodbye to the old order. And across Africa, the question whispered in villages and cities alike, if three nations can do this, why not more? This is not the story of one border or one region. It is the story of a continent daring to remember itself. At first, it seemed like any other day. The sun rose over the dry plains, and travelers prepared for another long wait at the border. Drivers lined up their trucks, mothers carried bags heavy with food, and students clutched their documents with nervous hands. They expected the same routine bribes, demanded forms, stamped hours lost. But that morning, something was different. The booths stood empty. The barriers were lifted. Soldiers who once checked passports now waved people through with a smile. A truck driver from Zambia was the first to notice. He pressed his foot on the gas, expecting to be stopped. Instead, he rolled past without a single question. He leaned out of his window and laughed a laugh that echoed through the convoy behind him. Soon dozens of trucks followed their horns, blasting like a chorus announcing a new era. No more delays, one driver shouted. No more chains. Families crossed as if walking into their neighbor's yard. A mother who had not seen her sister in 10 years wept openly at the sight of her. For so long she whispered, a line on a map kept us apart. Today that line is gone. Children ran across the invisible border, chasing each other, their laughter filling the air, once haunted by suspicion. In university towns, students waved flags outside government buildings, singing songs of unity. Some carried banners with simple but powerful words, "One Africa, one future." On social media, videos spread like wildfire, truck drivers cheering, mothers embracing youth chanting. Within hours, hashtags about the Borderless Africa Alliance trended across the continent. But while the streets of Africa celebrated conference rooms thousands of miles away, told a different story. In Washington, the news hit like a storm. The State Department convened an emergency meeting. Analysts studied maps and trade routes, whispering about copper, uranium, and diamonds flowing across borders without foreign oversight. The official statement was polished cautious. The United States welcomes regional cooperation, but stability must be safeguarded. Yet everyone in the room knew what that meant. Stability was not about peace, it was about control. Within hours, envoys boarded planes bound for Lusaka and Gaborone. Their briefcases carried promises of aid, but their words carried warnings. Slow down, they urged. Take more time. Consult your partners. Behind the smiles were veiled threats: aid could shrink, investments could vanish, security guarantees might be reconsidered. For the first time in decades, Africa was moving faster than Washington could react. The urgency, the scramble revealed what no press release would admit: the West was not prepared for an Africa that acted on its own terms. Back on the ground, the changes were immediate. Farmers in Namibia could now send produce to Zambian markets in half the time. Traders in Botswana spoke of profits rising because they no longer lost half their goods to red tape. Every border post dismantled was not just a gate removed, it was a chain broken. Yet perhaps the most powerful transformation was not economic, but emotional. For over a century, Africans were told to see each other through the categories written in Berlin Namibian versus Zambian Botswana versus Namibian. Overnight, those categories began to erode. Families reunited were not simply crossing borders, they were crossing centuries of division. Students traveling freely were not just seeking education, they were rewriting what it meant to belong. This was not only the action of three governments, it was the awakening of a people. A truck driver put it best when he said, "For the first time, I drive not through borders, but through bridges." The turning point was clear. Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It was walking forward with its own feet on its own road, carrying its own vision. And the world was watching, some with hope, others with fear. On the surface, the alliance of Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana looked like a technical agreement. Three governments removed barriers, signed a declaration, and promised easier trade. To many, it might have seemed like one more treaty among dozens written in the past. But beneath the headlines lay a truth far larger, a truth that could not be disguised. This was not just policy, it was liberation. For generations, Africa was taught that borders defined sovereignty. Guard the line, defend the checkpoint, prove your nationhood. But that definition was never written by Africans themselves. It was handed down by men in faraway capitals who once divided the continent like a chessboard. The truth now revealed was that sovereignty could also mean the courage to erase those lines, to choose unity over division. Every ordinary person felt that truth in ways more powerful than any speech. A Namibian mother crossing into Zambia with nothing more than her ID card did not see a policy shift. She saw her family restored. A student from Botswana entering a Zambian university without stacks of paperwork did not think of regional integration. He thought of his future finally opening before him. Traders crossing freely with copper and grain were not celebrating economic corridors. They were celebrating dignity, the simple right to move, to trade, to live without invisible chains. This is why the reaction outside Africa was so intense. The official words from Washington and European capitals spoke of stability. But in the coded language of diplomacy, stability often meant something else. It meant predictability. It meant control. It meant a system where Africa's resources from uranium to diamonds flowed on terms set elsewhere. What shook the old order was not only that three nations had acted together, it was the possibility that others might follow. Analysts admitted behind closed doors, if Zimbabwe joins, if Angola follows, if South Africa aligns, then the balance of power will change. That was the forbidden truth. The panic was not about one alliance. It was about a chain reaction, a domino that could topple the assumptions of an entire world order. And then came another revelation whispered, but impossible to ignore. In conversations across the continent, one name kept surfacing: Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. He was not at the signing in Windhoek, Lusaka, or Gaborone. Yet his presence hovered like a shadow of inspiration. His speeches about sovereignty, his defiance of pressure, his insistence that Africa must reclaim its destiny, all echoed the spirit of the borderless alliance. For many Africans, the connection was obvious. This was not just about Southern Africa. This was about a continent remembering its voice. The truth revealed is simple but profound. Africa does not need permission to define itself. When leaders act together, when people walk freely, when resources are valued not as gifts to others, but as assets for their own development, the entire equation shifts. Suddenly, old contracts lose their weight. Old bargains lose their legitimacy. That is why this story matters beyond Africa. For decades, the world has assumed Africa would remain divided, negotiating separately, vulnerable to pressure. But what happens when Africa decides otherwise? What happens when the very lines that once weakened it are erased? For the farmer, it means more markets. For the student, it means more opportunities. For the truck driver, it means fewer delays. But for the world, it means a recalculation of power. The forbidden truth is that a united Africa can no longer be ignored, managed, or contained. And so, the celebration in the streets carried more weight than joy alone. Mothers wept, students sang, truck drivers cheered, because on that day they were not only crossing borders, they were crossing history. When the declaration was signed, the sound was not thunder but paper. Yet its echo rolled far beyond Windhoek, Lusaka, and Gaborone. For Africa's people, the consequences were immediate and deeply human. For the rest of the world, they were unsettling, even alarming. In villages along the Zambezi, families who had grown used to waving across the river now crossed freely. Children ran into the arms of grandparents they once saw as foreign. Farmers walked their cattle across meadows without waiting for permits. Each crossing was small in distance, but vast in meaning. Every handshake across the former border was a piece of history rewritten. Markets pulsed with new energy. In Zambia, traders sold goods from Namibia within hours, not days. In Botswana, shopkeepers displayed fresh produce carried directly across without fees or middlemen. A Namibian farmer smiled as he told a reporter, "I used to lose half my profits at checkpoints. Now I keep what I earn." These were not statistics. They were lives transformed. Students felt it too. A young woman from Botswana described entering a Zambian university with only her ID card. It was like walking into the future, she said. For her education was no longer a privilege obstructed by paperwork. It was a path open to her generation. On social media, images spread of crowds waving flags and singing about unity. Hashtags like "Nak One Africa" and "Hab As Borders Fall" trended not only in Africa, but in diasporas across Europe and America. The sense of pride was contagious. For once, the story of Africa was not about crisis or conflict, it was about creation. But while ordinary people celebrated, leaders abroad calculated. In Washington, Paris, and London, official statements praised regional cooperation. Yet behind the careful words, unease grew. If three nations could act with such speed and confidence, what stopped others from joining? Analysts warned of a domino effect. Zimbabwe, Angola, even South Africa might align. Each new step would mean fewer opportunities for outside powers to divide, bargain, and influence. European investors worried too. Contracts once secure suddenly seemed fragile. If Africa negotiated as one, prices for copper, uranium, and diamonds might rise on African terms, not foreign ones. For companies long accustomed to favorable deals, The thought was unsettling. And there was another consequence: political pressure within Africa itself. Opposition parties and youth movements in other countries pointed to Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana as examples. If they can walk freely, why can't we? Asked callers on radio shows. Protest signs appeared in cities far from the alliance demanding similar reforms. Leaders hesitant to act found themselves cornered between tradition and transformation. The consequences rippled beyond economics and politics. They touched identity itself. Africans were reminded that their bonds ran deeper than the lines of Berlin. A Namibian grandmother put it simply, "I never believed I would live to see this day. I am not just Namibian, I am African." Her words captured the deeper truth. Unity was not an idea. It was now a lived reality. For foreign powers, the challenge was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time. Every new truckload of copper that rolled across without a bribe, every student who crossed a border with dignity, every family that reunited, these were quiet revolutions. The world order was not collapsing with noise, but shifting with footsteps. And yet within Africa, the mood was not of defiance, but of rebirth. Leaders spoke of responsibility, not conquest. Citizens spoke of hope, not anger. The alliance was not built to threaten others. It was built to heal Africa itself. But healing, as history shows, can sometimes be more disruptive than any weapon. The consequences were clear. Africa had discovered its power, and the world could no longer look away. The alliance of Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana is more than a border agreement. It is a strategic signal, one that reshapes how sovereignty, economics, and dignity are understood across Africa and beyond. To grasp its meaning, we must look not only at what happened, but at what it represents. For over a century, Africa's borders were treated as permanent. Leaders were told their duty was to protect those lines, even if it meant dividing families, slowing trade, and suffocating growth. But the alliance has rewritten that script. By choosing to dismantle colonial boundaries, these nations declared that sovereignty is not about defending artificial divisions. It is about choosing unity on African terms. This shift carries weight in 3 dimensions. First, economics. Borders once acted like dams, slowing the flow of trade and forcing countries to depend on outside markets instead of each other. Now, trucks roll freely with copper, uranium, grain, and livestock. Farmers keep more of their earnings. Businesses cut costs. Students move more easily to find opportunities. In practical terms, this means African nations gain leverage. When economies integrate, they can negotiate stronger trade deals, set fairer prices for resources, and reduce dependency on foreign aid. Second, politics. For decades, Africa was vulnerable because it was divided. Foreign powers could approach each state separately, offering aid. Here contracts their military support elsewhere. A united front changes that equation. Negotiations shift from being one-sided to balanced. Leaders who embrace unity are praised as visionaries. Those who cling to colonial relics risk being seen as out of step with history. Opposition movements are already seizing this language, demanding integration as a right, not a privilege. Third, psychology. Perhaps the most profound change is in how Africans see themselves. For generations, identity was fractured, Namibian, Zambian, Botswana categories imposed by others. Now people are reminded of older, deeper ties, shared languages, cultures, and bloodlines. The borderless alliance becomes more than a policy. It becomes a mirror reflecting a truer self. That awakening is powerful because once people see beyond imposed limits, they rarely return to accepting them. What does this mean for the rest of the world? The answer is both hopeful and unsettling. In Washington, stability has long been code for predictability, and Africa divided, manageable, accessible. The alliance disrupts that predictability. If Zimbabwe, Angola, or South Africa join, the balance of power tilts. Contracts may be renegotiated, resource prices recalculated, foreign bases questioned. For Western capitals, the fear is not conflict, it is irrelevance. But there is also an opportunity if the world chooses to see it. A stronger united Africa does not mean hostility. It means partnership on fairer terms. It means trade that benefits both sides, not just one. It means a continent capable of solving its own problems without needing endless interventions. That should not be a threat. It should be a relief. For an American audience, this moment carries echoes of history. Think back to Selma in 1965, when people marched across a bridge not just for themselves, but for the idea of dignity. Think back to Vietnam, when citizens questioned whether power abroad could ever justify pain at home. Think back to Watergate, when faith in institutions was tested by hidden truths. Each time Americans faced the choice of silence or conscience, Africa is facing that same choice now. The strategic lesson is simple unity changes everything. Where division invites control, unity commands respect. Where fragmentation breeds dependency, solidarity breeds sovereignty. The alliance shows that Africans no longer accept the logic of isolation. Instead, they embrace the logic of togetherness. And here is where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso become central. Though not part of this Southern alliance, his insistence on self-reliance and sovereignty resonates across the continent. He symbolizes a broader shift, a generation of leaders unafraid to question the old order, unafraid to claim that Africa's destiny belongs to Africa. This is not about rejecting others. It is about remembering oneself. When Africans cross borders freely, when they trade without fear, when they define sovereignty in their own language, they are not turning away from the world. They are stepping into it with dignity. The question is whether the world is ready to meet them on equal ground. There are moments in history when silence is no longer neutral. This is one of them. The borderless alliance in Southern Africa is not only a policy decision. It is a signal to the world that the chains of Berlin are finally rusting away. For families reunited, for students crossing freely, for traders walking with dignity, this is more than convenience. It is liberation. But liberation is never guaranteed. It must be protected, nourished, and carried forward. The question now is not whether Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana can keep their promise. The question is whether others will join them, whether Zimbabwe, Angola, South Africa, and even Burkina Faso will dare to step across the same invisible lines. For those watching in America, this is not a distant story. It is a mirror. Just as generations marched in Selma for civil rights, just as veterans questioned the wars they saw broadcast from Vietnam, just as citizens demanded truth during Watergate, so now Africa demands recognition of its dignity. To ignore this is to forget the lessons of conscience written in your own history. If you believe justice is more than a slogan, if you believe freedom is not granted but claimed, then this story belongs to you as much as it belongs to us. Share it, speak it, remember it. Because what began at 3 border posts may yet become the blueprint for a continent rising. And if you ever wondered whether justice still has a place in our world, listen to the echo of these words. If you once believed in justice, then now is the time to remember why.